should be yourself, King. Should be yourself. And really the greatest thing that you could be is to be yourself.
God created you on purpose for a purpose, and this is the space where we help you become who you were made to be. Today I have a great guest on named Tim. And Tim is a very interesting guest. He's a podcaster, he's a financial planner, and like me, he was a pharmacist. And we have a lot to talk about, both being from having a pharmacist background. So I'm incredibly excited to talk to him about his journey as a pharmacist and how he's later transitioned into his own entrepreneurial endeavors and creative outlets. So Tim, thank you so much for coming on. And for those who don't know, he's also the author of the book, The Seven Figure Pharmacist, which I also had the pleasure of reading. So I'm grateful for your time and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and you're an inspiration as well. I love what you're doing with the podcast, and admire anyone who's willing to put themselves out there, in that way, and to inspire and motivate others. And as you already know, one of the great benefits of podcasting, which I know you didn't go into it for this reason, is you get to meet some awesome people. I mean, that's something that, as I've been podcasting since 2017, it's just been so many rich relationships that have come out of interviewing someone, right? We get to know a little bit more about them. So love what you're doing. Keep pressing on, man.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah, I've came across all types of interesting people. Some mentors I've formed relationships from this podcast. Been able to do networking with real estate investors, and even made some friends here. So I completely agree with you, boss. All right, so Tim, I really wanted to focus this conversation that we have on focusing on the identity shift from being a pharmacist towards another career or entrepreneurial endeavor, or just something else. Because I feel like, obviously as pharmacists, I can relate to what you're doing, because I have a podcast and I invest in real estate. But I think it's bigger than just pharmacists. I do think a lot of people put too much of a identity in their career, a job that they don't even like, and yet that's like where they put much of their identity. And I really wanted to dive into what that transition was like for you personally, going from working as a pharmacist to a financial planner.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. And let me first just clarify, so no one's misled from a listener standpoint. So I, as the owner of Your Financial Pharmacist, a company that I started, I have a team of certified financial planners that do our planning work. I myself am not a financial planner. Maybe we can talk more about kind of that, and why I went down that path and made that decision. But I want to make sure to be transparent and clear in that. I think this topic is so interesting.
Same.
And it's not pharmacy specific, as you mentioned. And there's a lot of pressure that I felt. There's a lot of pressure that I see, especially among those that are, maybe just getting started, just graduating, where, you invest 6 to 8 plus years of time. You invest a significant amount of money, right? If we look at the most recent data we have from the graduating class of 2025, again, talking about pharmacy here, $170,000 student loan debt. That's the median number, all right? Big number. And when you spend a lot of time and you spend a lot of money, and you obtain an advanced degree, right? We're kind of set up for a couple things happening. One, there's this identity enmeshment that's happening, what you're talking about, where when I went to pharmacy school out of high school, I went to a 06 PharmD. 24, I woke up, right? Had my doctorate degree. I was told at the age of 18, you're going to be a doctor of pharmacy. So right out of the gates, I don't think there's ill intent, but there's this identity that is forming that becomes maybe enmeshed in a way that isn't necessarily healthy or where we want it to be long term. Yeah. And that's happening at a very formative young age, right? Yeah. Typically, think about this as somebody who's going more of a traditional educational pathway, maybe a 4-year undergrad, and then they either may enter the workforce or they go back to school. They're still in a very exploratory phase at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. I was at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and it was like, you're going to be a doctor of pharmacy, right? No wonder why there's an identity challenge that happens. And when those things start to come together, that's where I think we really see challenges happening later in one's career, where if we think about opportunities to pivot or maybe do something different, or I feel stuck, or I'm in a role that maybe isn't a good fit, that's a very quiet voice that if we pay attention to and really give it some oxygen, it starts to become louder and louder for some people, but we want to suppress it because of these challenges we have around identity. And for me, like, I'd love to share more personally as you want to dig deeper. For me, I had a mentor that introduced something to me called the IR theory.
Okay.
I and R stands for identity and role. Okay. And when I heard this for the first time, I was like, whoa, I get it. Right. And it really put words to some of the dissonance that I was feeling internally. And the point of it is that your identity, my identity, and how we've been created, we are a 10 out of 10 every day. That never changes. You're a 10 out of 10 every day. I'm a 10 out of 10 every day. Where we get in trouble is when we let our performance in roles, so R stands for roles, I stands for identity, how we perform in our roles, right? So for me, I have a role as a father, I have a role as a husband, I have a role as a business owner, right? We wear many different roles, many different hats. And it's not physically possible to be perfect in those every day, right? So I might have one day where I'm like, you know what, as a business owner today, because of all the things that happened in the day, I feel like a 5 out of 10, right? Or because of, how I handled the situation with my kids, I wish I would have done it better. I feel like a 6 out of 10. Now, when we can really understand that despite our performance, that our identity, who we are, who we've been designed to be, who we're created to be, that doesn't change. It's always a 10 out of 10. But when we let our performance and how we feel about our performance become our identity, wow, that's where things get really messy, right? So what I have to remind myself is, Tim, you know what? As a business owner today, didn't go as well as you wanted it, or as a pharmacist today, or as a father, or as a husband, didn't. But that doesn't change my identity. And once we can start to separate those out and be an observer of that rather than being meshed in that, I think things really start to open up.
Yeah, man. Dude, I can tell you've put a lot of thought into this topic, because you and I could go on and off about this. And the interesting thing is, like, because for pharmacists, you go to school for about 6+ years, some people 8, some people even more than that.
Sure.
So like you said, you got the time investment, then you got the financial costs. It isn't common. It's uncommon for people to spend more than over $100K worth of debt. And then also, I think perhaps what makes it even harder too is the incredible amount of social validation.
Absolutely.
Wow, you're a doctor. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of like the epitome of like success in like America, in the world. People have so much respect for pharmacists, doctors, and whatnot. So it's almost like you can't be quote unquote a failure in the way people look at you. And despite all of that, I too have had an internal dissonance. Whenever I speak to people, I didn't even get that excited about telling people much that, hey, I'm a pharmacist. Like, I didn't feel like that was all of me. And there was so much more to being Ike than just being a pharmacist.
Oh man, yeah.
And when we talk about pharmacy school, and I think college in general does this, the weird thing about pharmacy school and college experiences is like you go to school for 4, 6, however many years to learn a skill, but then whatever you learn in school is completely different than what you actually do in your job. So it's kind of like, all right, we went to school for so long, but I don't know. Like, for example, you go to retail pharmacy, and oftentimes when I was working at Rite Aid, I was like, I went to school for 6 years to like do something so simple. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if you ever had that experience or that like dissonance, where I'm like, I don't think I needed to go to school for this long to learn everything I'm doing now,
Yeah, and I think what we're touching on is a really deep topic of external versus internal validation, right?
Yeah.
So Ike is Ike, who happens to be a pharmacist.
Yeah.
That is one of your roles. That is not your identity. Tim is Tim, who happens to be a pharmacist, who happens to own a company that does financial wellness and planning for pharmacists. But that's not my identity, right? And I remember a mentor saying to me once, like, when some of this enmeshment was happening. So he's like, so it's at some point in time when your kids are out of the house, right? Or you're no longer a pharmacist because you're doing it. Does that mean like there's nothing there. Like you aren't someone, you aren't anything, right? So
Yeah.
this is where we get in trouble. And the examples you gave are really good ones, because when we talk about the societal validation around this, that's an external validation. And where I see pharmacists often struggling is they've never been given the space to really look at, like, is this what I want to do? And that's not a pharmacy, no pharmacy. I mean, you can have a PharmD or an MD or any degree for that matter, and you can go multiple different pathways. One of the things I see pharmacists getting stuck with that I felt early in my career is I often felt like it was the pressure of climbing a ladder, almost like I was on a one-way street.
Yeah.
And really, as I now look back almost 20 years later, and I can see the zigs and the zags in my career path and be okay with that it wasn't always linear.
Yeah.
We really should think more about our career path like climbing a rock wall versus climbing a ladder, right? Sometimes you go up, you go down, you go backwards, you go sideways, and you're acquiring different skills and experiences and learning about yourself along the way. And it's okay if you wake up and you're 35 and you realize, hey, where I started at 20, now I like different things, that's normal. That's okay, right? But to your point, there's so much pressure. And, for the work that we do, there's often financial pressure. And the job that they're working can often be the financial handcuffs that, because I've got student loan debt, because I've got these other things, I don't feel like I can move elsewhere. I'm stuck, right? Is kind of that feeling.
Yeah. I remember being in pharmacy school, because, you mentioned about, you're talking about how there's a ladder and there's like a linear path. I felt that to a T. And I remember in pharmacy school, we only pretty much learned about like three type of jobs. Either you're retail, or you go to a hospital, or perhaps like industry. And like, that's really like, those are like the main ones. And like, I didn't really like any of the paths. I went to retail. That was probably the one that I liked the most, but even that didn't really feel like me. And like hospital and industry, there's like this linear path of like, okay, like you can slowly, maybe you start off as a staff pharmacist, then you upgrade, you might become a director, or like it's like the goal is to just kind of like promote yourself in this one singular environment. And I didn't like the lack of opportunity to learn or explore other areas, so I completely agree with you, man. And this whole dissonance that we've been experiencing, how have you dealt with that personally, and how have you been able to transition from it? I know one thing that you mentioned actually on LinkedIn was like you journal a lot. I'm just curious, what are some of the things you do for yourself to take away that shift of identity and find purpose in other things?
I'm glad you're asking this question, because I think there's some surface level stuff as I think about my transition where, this is how I started the business, and this is how I validated the idea, and this is how, and all of that is good and important. But the real answer to this for me lies into really getting to know myself better. Like, do I really know like who Tim is, and do I know what Tim wants? And am I willing to explore that without judgment, without the guardrails that, hey, I happened to go to pharmacy school and I accrued a bunch of debt and I paid off a lot of debt. And, a term that's commonly used in our industry is called the sunk cost fallacy, which is, hey, once I've invested so much time and energy, it's hard to pivot off of something, right? Because we've already put so much into it. And so, as I really started to dig deeper, which gets to the question you're asking about journaling and other things, and really get to know myself, which I feel like is a lifelong journey. This is not work that's done by any means, and really got more comfortable looking at myself in the mirror. Who are you? What do you want? And how can we separate out some of these identities and roles such that as these roles will naturally change, shift, and evolve, some might get added, some might go away, some might like different. That doesn't change. The truths that I need to hear every day are, you are enough. You are a 10 out of 10. I need to be reminded of that every single day, right? So that really was that inner work that to me was the unlocking of what then probably maybe, comes out and presents itself externally, whether it be the business growing or other things, right? Behind all of that, I feel like is a whole lot of inner growth that will continue on. So what does that practically look like day to day, week to week, month to month? I mean, journaling is a huge thing for me. So I've got a pretty well-established morning routine that's evolved over years. I have a young family, so some seasons this has looked different than others, right? And right now what that looks like is about a 2-hour block every day to start the day. It's kind of a non-negotiable, unless I have to put something on top of it, like it needs to be there. And in that 2 hours, I'm starting with walking outside, getting some sunlight exposure, having some mental space to think, having some time in devotional and prayer, having some time to connect with other men, having some time to do some journaling and reflection and some vision setting. And there's a routine to that morning. And that is such a critical piece, especially for me as a morning person. Like, that sets the tone and energy for the day, right? That's the key. And again, it's evolved. It's looked different over time, but that is a huge piece of making sure that the day is starting off. And when that doesn't happen, like, I notice it, I feel the energy shifts. Another big piece for me, especially over the last couple years, is I've done a lot of work with some men's groups around some of the somatic work. So really kind of getting more into my body, understanding like what's going on situationally, how am I feeling, connecting what my body is telling me with the emotions, whether it be fear, anxiety, sadness, joy, etc., having a language to that, and then being able to use that language and some of those skills to really navigate the world around me, right? Then that can be in family, that can be in parenting and marriage, that can be in business and so forth. And I think so often for myself, and I probably would guess for maybe a lot of your listeners, we often live so much in our head. And we're just running, right, all day long. And I think when we really start to kind of implement some of the things to slow down, check in with our bodies, get our feet on the ground, like ground ourselves in those moments, things start to slow down a little bit,
Yeah.
But I've grown up in an environment, I just go, right? So I'm constantly having to like, bring it back. Yeah.
I'm curious if you've ever had this type of issue personally, but one of the issues I've kind of come across recently that is the identity and achievement. I think for me, I used to put so much identity in achieving and becoming and getting more. And I felt like I don't know. It's a weird way because there's nothing wrong with accomplishing. But for example, like going to pharmacy school for me was an achievement. And then once I didn't have pharmacy school, I was like, okay, what else am I going to achieve? Then it became real estate, and I started getting a bunch of properties. I got 1 property, 2 properties, 3 properties. And then after a while, it started to become less and less fulfilling. And I started to realize like I had this, I don't want to say addiction to achieving, but I always felt like if I wasn't achieving, I was useless. Like I wasn't enough. I don't know if you ever came across that thing too, because being part of pharmacy school, there's kind of like an accomplishment or like an achievement thing that happens that, you take a lot of pride in. And it probably started off academically, because if you're a pharmacist, you probably did pretty well in school in general. And I'm sure, a lot of pharmacists and people can relate.
Yeah, I think there's a few things you're touching on, and let me just say right out of the gates, 100%, I can relate with that. I have struggled with that. I continue to struggle with that.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm working in the direction where I can see it for what, naming it is step number 1, right? So kudos to you. Like, for me, really coming around and naming what I was feeling already, which was some of these fleeting experiences, right? The dopamine hits with the accomplishments, kind of the chase. And then it was sort of like, now what? Right. And and it just keeps going. You move on to something else, And now as I look back in my career, like a lot of that very much was present. And I think I would call it personally, for me, not speaking for you, like I would call it an addiction to achievement. Right.
Yeah.
And I remember talking with a counselor about this, and he really helped me reframe it to say, and there's a great book called Driven. I'm forgetting the author, that actually talks about, for a certain subset of the population, there's actually a genetic makeup where, if you're that person who's a driven person, you can't kind of shut that off. Like fighting against that, like if that's who you innately are, is kind of a hard thing to do. And so, having some language around that, understanding that, and really looking at this as not something that is a bad thing, but it can become that when it's out of balance. Right. And I remember a counselor saying to me, like, Tim, this drive that you have, right? This feeling of a sense of wanting to do or to achieve or to make contributions, like that is a gift. It's an innate gift. However, Like when it becomes your identity, what we were just talking about, when it becomes your identity, things get all out of balance, right?
Yeah.
Things get all out of it. And it's a razor's edge, type of thing. It's very, very thin where you see that line go. So I think just, again, going back to tuning into my body and understanding, like innately, I really like to innovate, to come up with ideas, to solve problems, to, create businesses, to have a contribution, to all of those are good things, but really paying attention to, hey, when is that getting out of balance? Like if I'm never enjoying the process and I'm only defined by what the outcome is, and that's tied up in my identity, and we know that the feelings of actually getting to the finish line will be fleeting at some point, that's a problem, right? And so how do I day to day, week to week, month to month, really make sure that I'm also in the moment experiencing and treasuring the process and not just focused on the outcome? And that is hard. Like that's really hard. But that goes back to, what we were talking about a little bit of some of these daily habits and rhythms and routines. So like journaling for me has been an important piece of that, of acknowledging day by day, like what are the things that are happening? What are the things that I'm grateful for? Not just always focused on 6 months into the future or 2 year, whatever it might be. And one book in particular called The Gap and the Gain, by Dan Sullivan, really helped me put some language around this. He says that we so often measure ourselves by this ideal future state that may or may not ever come to be, or it may not even actually be real. He kind of describes it as like the sunset on the horizon. Like you're just always kind of, and that's a gap mindset where we look at the gap and we're constantly measuring ourselves, and we're always in this comparison, kind of competition, scarcity type of mind. The alternative he provides is what he calls living in the gain, which is instead of measuring ourselves by this perhaps unrealistic future state that may or may not ever come, why are we looking backwards to acknowledge where we've come from? That's objective. That's real. And we can actually see that, appreciate that, and build momentum from it. And that, I think, really also puts ourselves in very much a present here mindset versus an aspirational, what may or may not come in the future mindset.
Yeah, man. So powerful. So many good points. As you were speaking, actually, it reminded me of, I put in my bathroom like a picture of my younger self, just to remind myself of how far I've come.
That's great.
I think it's important, man. Like, and I think just like to say, comparison is the thief of joy. And I think the only people we should really be comparing ourselves is our former selves, man. So to hear what you're speaking about, honestly, I truly resonate with it, and I think one thing I would like to understand better is how do people get away from that mentality and slowly become more grounded in who they are. Because for me as a pharmacist, one thing that I personally struggled with was starting this podcast, and also just doing other things outside of that, being a DJ, because maybe didn't make enough. I DJ for fun. I actually have a great gig that I'm coming up. I'm looking forward to my friend's wedding, but stuff like that. It was really hard for me to get out of things outside of pharmacy and make money outside of that. How do you find appreciation in or identity, root yourself in other things like that?
Yeah, what's coming up for me, I think there's a lot of ways you could go here in terms of, whether it be hiring coaches or other types of things. What's coming up for me is look at the energy of your day-to-day, week-to-week, and who are the closest people that you're surrounded by that are influencing that energy, right? Because we know this, like the people that are closest in our inner circle and how they are living their lives, the energy in which they carry themselves, whether or not they have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset, right? How they're thinking about their own development or growth. We feed off of that. And, as we've learned through Joe Dispenza's work, like that energy interaction is a very real thing. And so when you are surrounding yourself Now, sometimes we have more control over this over others, right? But when you are surrounding yourself with individuals that are really challenging themselves to grow and to really lean into understanding who they are and their own identity, and how do I live to the fullest potential of who I've been created and designed to be? When you have other people around you that are of that same mindset and energy, man, we vastly underestimate how powerful that is.
Yeah.
So, if that's not there, I'm thinking about, like what's coming to mind for me is the everyday pharmacist who's maybe at, chain pharmacy, who's filling 500 scripts a day, that's looking at this. They're 35. They've been doing it for, 5-10 years. And they're like, what am I going to do for the next 25?
Yeah.
Right. Now, I'm not here to hate on community pharmacy. In fact, I think community pharmacists are just a critical resource in this country. And in fact, there's many pharmacists that really do enjoy that work and are having an incredible impact. So do not hear this and think that I'm hating on community pharmacy. But I've talked with many individuals who are in that situation I just described.
Yeah.
Right. And just visualize that for a moment.
Yep.
You're walking into work, right? You just came off of a 12-hour shift the night before. You get home, you don't have the energy to probably, engage the way that you want with your loved ones. You don't have the energy to maybe eat the way that you want. You don't have the energy to go work out, to journal, to do all the mindset things that we're talking about. You wake up the next day, you get your coffee going, you walk back into the same environment. There's baskets that are waiting for you. The phones are ringing. That is a mental energy grind and suck, whether you name it or not, right? So if that's your environment, and then you're going home, or you have other colleagues or friends, or maybe you don't have a whole lot of community because life's gotten busy and you've just lost community, we need to get a breath of fresh air into that situation, right? So when I think about the people that have really transformed my mindset, my energy, right? It's the men's groups that I'm talking about. It's about my wife, who has a similar approach and mindset. It's my, best friends that we down in Texas, that we audio message every day to encourage one another and kind of live life together. These don't happen by happenstance, right? We have to develop this community, this relationship, whether it's friends, family, coaches, mentors, masterminds, whatever you want to call them. But if we want to really know who we are and live to our fullest potential, are we surrounding ourselves with people that also have that same desire? Because that energy is contagious. There is no question about it.
Yeah, man. When you were speaking about the despair of working in community pharmacy, I can relate to it personally. I last time I worked at Rite Aid, it was like 3-4 years ago. But I remember there were days I would literally be working 4 to 5 12-hour shifts day to day. And man, I was young, so obviously I can do it, and I had the energy, but I don't know, man. It didn't feel right for me. And then for me personally, the worst part about it is, you would work really hard, and at least in the setting I didn't feel like I was being appreciated. If anything, the conversation was like, hey, why didn't you do more vaccines? Why didn't you do more flu shots? And I'm like, bro, I'm literally the only pharmacist here, and I have no technicians, and I'm understaffed. And you're like, you know what I'm saying? And so I felt like, I don't know, man. I feel like, unfortunately, that's the reality of a lot of people. And again, not necessarily bashing on community pharmacy, but to make a point that I feel like a lot of people are in jobs that they don't necessarily enjoy and don't know how to get out of it. And that's, I think, the root of the issue, because when I was working at Rite Aid, I knew I didn't want to be there forever. But then the majority of the pharmacists I spoke to, at least most of them didn't really want to be there. They were just kind of like, oh, it pays the bills, so like, I'm just going to keep doing it. That was really more the attitude. It wasn't like, yeah, I'm really happy to do this. If someone asks you, hey, do you want to be a manager? A lot of pharmacists were, no, I don't want any more responsibility. And so that struggle was very there.
Let's dig deeper here, because I think we're getting to the crux of the issue for many people listening, right?
Yeah.
Potentially, or maybe it's not them, but a loved one or a family member that they're trying to help or whatever. And let me first say that I'm not dismissing that there should be a better environment or culture, right? So everything you're saying totally resonates. I agree with what you're saying, that, hey, if I'm working 5 12-hour back-to-back shifts and I'm asking to be do more, and we're in flu season and I don't feel appreciated, Like, is that the right culture? No, it should be better, right? And we should have better ways to appreciate our pharmacists. We should have better ways, to acknowledge them. Obviously we've talked about workplace conditions and many different. So all of that needs to be happening. But here's the thing: if we only focus on those things, Ike, and I think this is where people get stuck. Those are all external factors, many of which someone doesn't actually have control over. Insert stuck. Right.
Yeah.
But we sit in that stuck place, or we could have a tendency to sit in that stuck place because it deflects the responsibility. And I remember reading something a while ago that I just always come back to, where it was very gently and lovingly saying, no one is coming to rescue you. No one is coming to rescue you. Once you understand that and you really believe it and you shift your mindset, and of course, easier said than done, right? Yeah. There's real situations. We got to put food on the table. Of course, there's a way in which we approach these things. But once that mindset shift happens, man, it's a totally different game that we're playing. Right. It's back to this internal, external thing that we're talking about. So put yourself back in that situation. I think you're probably actually a great example of what I know in your career story. So you could look at that all day and say, you know what? They should appreciate me more. Yeah, they should. I agree with you. They should have more staff in the store. Absolutely. I agree with you. They should not necessarily have the expectations they have around flu shots during flu season I agree with you. All those things are true. Are you going to change the culture from a corporate standpoint where that maybe, keep going, right? We need that as well, right?
Yeah.
However, let's talk about what you can take control over and responsibility for. Nobody is forcing you to stay in that store, stay in that environment. Now, is it going to be difficult to transition? Might you give up some salary? Might you deal with a gap of employment? Yeah, these are all very real things, which is why we're passionate about the work that we do to help people be able to financially manage this so they're not a prisoner to an environment that's not a good fit. But the key difference as we're talking about this is one of you taking ownership and responsibility, one of potentially somebody deflecting, right? That to me is the crux of everything we're talking about here. It's understanding, same scenario, nothing has changed, but how you are viewing that situation and understanding what you can take control over, night and day.
Gotcha. So kind of, instead of necessarily blaming things you can't control, like the corporate setting or the nature of being understaffed, you can probably switch it to being like, hey, well, I did put myself in this position, and hey, I can always leave if I really don't like this job, or there's things I can do to better my situation. I think it gets easier said than done, because I feel like most, especially in pharmacy, you only drill down on certain career paths, so you don't know other options and you don't know where else to go, especially when you're 6 years into it and then you got the debt. But I would imagine as someone with a company like yours, where you help people financially plan, that definitely gives people a lot more for the step to take more risk. So I do want to transition into the nature of financial planning and the book, The Seven Figure Pharmacist, because
let's go.
Let's be real. When you have a lot of money, or when you have enough money saved up, you can pick and choose what you really want to do. And I think you can more likely align yourself with what you really want to do, instead of being in a position where you just have to be there because you just want to make money and you don't really like it,
Yeah, and let me just address one thing as we make this transition here. And Ike, you're an example of it, right? So you took ownership, you took responsibility, and you looked at, hey, maybe there's an alternative path. And these things don't always have to be one or the other. Yeah. So let me give you, for instance, if you're in an environment where you say, you know what, this isn't the environment for me. And maybe because I've got $200,000 student loan debt, because I've got a young family, because I've got a mortgage, because I have all these things that I need this income at this level, that doesn't absolve you of any responsibility elsewhere. Yeah. So as you think about, maybe it's not tomorrow, but what can you do over the next 6 to 12 months, even while you maintain your employment in that position? What can you start to do that will potentially lay the seeds that might bear fruit in 6 or 12 months? And what I think we often underestimate, Ike, is even if it means I'm not actually moving my job, as the example we're talking about now, tomorrow, when you start to take ownership and action, even if your circumstance doesn't change right in front of you this moment, that momentum is very real, because you've now starting to take back some of the energy, some of the power, if you will, right? And you're now starting to really re-believe in yourself a little bit of, hey, maybe it's retraining, maybe it's additional credentialing that you need, maybe it's attending some network. I don't know what it is. Like there's a million paths that we go, but many people have made these transitions, and it really started, I think, with a belief in themselves and starting to take ownership of some of those things. But absolutely, when we talk about the financial stuff, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic, Ike, is that if you have a strong financial foundation, and we could talk about what that looks like, but if you have a strong financial foundation, you can play offense instead of defense, right? Whether it's something of your choosing, hey, I would like to look at a different role. Maybe I take a little bit of pay cut for whatever reason. I want to take a step back in my hours. I know a pharmacist that took a year off to travel the world. Maybe it's I have a sick family member and I want to spend more time taking care of them. Whatever is the scenario, it gives you options and flexibility. And that's what we need to remember, is that money in and of itself isn't the goal. It's what can we do because of the financial plan, because of the money.
Yes. Yeah. Everything you're saying to me really speaks to my soul, because, I used to work at Rite Aid as a retail pharmacist, and I would say they paid more. Now, what I do is I work as a prior authorization pharmacist, and that is a slight pay cut. You know what I'm saying? But for me, it is well worth it because of the time I get back. Because one, I get to work from home, so I save myself maybe an hour or two from commuting. Two, it's just a lot more flexible. Three, the work culture is a lot more friendlier and in line with a lot of me. So even though the pay cut is there, I think the benefits gained from it and the amount of time saved is way worth it, So
and this is why I think, especially if you have anybody listening that's maybe a little bit earlier in their career, this is why it's so important to try to do whatever you can early on, right? To not allow that lifestyle to go right up to your income, right? Because it becomes like you were able to make that transition. Some people, if they're 5, 7, 10 years in, they might look at that and say, because of things are just that well established in terms of family, house, student loan debt, all the things that come, like they may feel like they don't have an option with income. And so if we can proactively give ourselves, some wiggle room, I'll often say, Ike, that the financial plan is as simple and hard as living off of less than you make, so you can have options of what you do with the rest.
Gotcha, man. Yeah. So let's talk about that. First of all, you wrote a book called The Seven Figure Pharmacist. I have to ask, are you a 7-figure pharmacist?
I am. And I'm actually in the very early stages of kind of writing a follow-up to that book, which will get into more of the kind of playbook style, as well as what happens next, right?
Yeah. Gotcha. So you are a 7-figure pharmacist, and you wrote this book essentially talking about how we can financially plan our way towards becoming more financially healthy, and one thing that you've done that caught my eye, that I think a lot of people are trying to do, is eliminate student loan debt. I'm not gonna lie, I still have a lot of student loan debt as a pharmacist, and I hope one day I can resolve it. I'm hoping another government or something could just do it, but again, it's kind of like what we talked about. We can't depend on external, so I'm curious, what did you do to bridge yourself over $200K of debt?
For me, I really didn't know what I didn't know. So when I came out of pharmacy school with a little over $200,000 student loan debt, I made all the mistakes, right? That are kind of the classic mistakes. I kind of had this mentality when I was in school of like, figure it out when you actually earn some money later, right? So I made the classic mistake of like, hey, what's another $20,000 when you're in school? I didn't understand, principal versus interest, subsidized, unsubsidized. I didn't understand repayment options or plans. And the problem with that, which is also true for a lot of new graduates, is that student loans are so often the tail that wags the dog financially. And what I mean by that is, when you have a couple $100,000 of student loan debt, your monthly payment might easily be $1,500, $2,000 or more a month.
Yeah.
Well, if you're making, let's say, $7,000 a month of take-home pay, we're starting to talk about, a third ish
Yeah.
of your take home pay. So it's very hard to plan anything else, right?
Yeah.
Often people will say like, hey, Tim, should I buy a home or should I be investing or what should I be doing? And I'll say, it depends. Like, tell me what's going on. Like, how much debt do you have? What's the home purchase goal look like? Where are you at with investing? So often we have to first put this piece of the puzzle in place so we can build around it. And the problem with this right now, Ike, is it's more confusing than it's ever been, right? So when I came out of school and I paid it off, I didn't know what I didn't know, which meant I went down the standard 10-year repayment. I kind of realized I wasn't making a whole lot of progress. I technically qualified for public service loan forgiveness, but I didn't even know what that program was back at the time. I could have refinanced my loans, but I didn't know what that was either at the time. So I was just kind of blindly, marching down the path. And then we ended up, my wife Jess and I ended up really going down an aggressive repayment where we were throwing big extra monthly payments at it. And we got the job done. Like, we got it done, but we made it a whole lot harder than it had to be, right? If I look backwards, I could have pursued loan forgiveness. I could have pursued refinancing, perhaps even done something like an income-driven repayment plan. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the mistake I commonly see being made is for people that have a couple $100,000 in debt, because the system is so overwhelming, they kind of blindly enter into a strategy without knowing, is it the best strategy? And layered on top of that is we have a bill that was just passed in July that is putting a bunch of changes into student loan repayment. And now people are more confused than they've ever been. Yeah. So back to where we started, the conversation about taking ownership is I can complain that it shouldn't be this hard, that why are interest rates so hard? Why are there so many repayment plans? It's too confusing. And keep complaining, right? And maybe that will turn into fruitful advocacy efforts. But at the end of the day, it ain't changing the number. So we got to figure out and take ownership of learning and understanding what the repayment plans are and how do we best optimize it for our own situation.
How did it, you mentioned a good point about the big, beautiful bill. I'm curious. I don't know if you know, but how did the big, beautiful bill change the nature of student loans? Did it, or did anything change?
Yeah, big changes. And there's kind of two buckets. There's some changes for borrowers coming in the future. So like new students, they're going to have some pretty significant caps on graduate loans. Some of the Parent Plus loan stuff is going to have significant change. So it is going to have impact on future borrowers. The piece that is perhaps most worrisome to me is that it's also going to have significant changes on current borrowers, whether that be those in school or those that are already in active repayment. And the reason why I say worrisome is that prior to the big, beautiful bill, any changes that were talked about with student loans, they were always talked about as if they were going to impact future borrowers, but that current borrowers would be grandfathered in, and that is not the case here. So what's essentially going to happen? I won't bore your listeners with all the details, but essentially what's going to happen is they're going from several different income-driven repayment plans, really narrowing it down to two options in the future. You either have the standard 10-year repayment plan, which is a fixed kind of monthly payment, or you have what's called the WRAP plan, which is a new income-driven repayment plan. And then for those that are already in active repayment, they also can enter into income-based repayment, which is one of the other repayment plans that are out there. So less options and not as favorable to the borrower is really the Cliff Note version.
Okay. So, you mentioned when you paid off your $200K debt that you were just super aggressive with it, and you and your wife were able to tackle the issue together, and that was beautiful. But then you also, interesting, mentioned you didn't know what you didn't know, even though I felt like that's an amazing thing, but you feel like it sounds like you would have done things differently, right? Or
yeah.
So what is that thing you would have done differently?
Great question. I think the most advantageous mathematical path we could have taken was to pursue public service loan forgiveness. To pay as little as possible out of pocket, to get as much forgiven tax-free as possible. And then all of those extra payments we were throwing at our debt, if we were on a loan forgiveness trajectory, we could have put it towards savings or other financial goals. So we paid more than we had to pay. So that would have been option one. If I didn't do that for whatever reason, let's say I didn't either work for a qualifying employer. I wasn't comfortable with it, whatever be the situation. In my case, it was, I just didn't know. The second best option would have been probably to refinance my loan. So at the time, no longer the case because of where interest rates are, but at the time, many of my pharmacy school loans were at 6.8%.
Oh, wow.
And I could have refinanced them down high 3s, low 4s, something like that. But I didn't understand what that term meant. I didn't understand what the pros and cons were. And so because of that, we kind of stayed put in the federal system and we paid more interest than we had to. So either one of those would have been better. Again, I look back with gratitude. We got the job done.
Yeah.
We kind of united around that goal. It really accelerated our financial plan. I think was the catapult to other things. But it was harder than it had to be, right? And we could have done it more efficiently.
Gotcha. So once you became once you paid off the $200K debt, it catapulted you and gave you the freedom to do other things. I know you got other businesses and other projects going on. What other I'm curious to learn about like your journey towards becoming a seven-figure pharmacist, because you paid off your debt now, and now you're slowly building your net worth. What did that journey look like? Because hopefully one day I would like to be a seven-figure pharmacist too. That's why I brought your book. I'm still working towards it.
Well, it sounds like you're on that path, especially the real estate piece, which I do think is an important diversification piece. So in our I wouldn't consider myself a big real estate investor, but in our financial plan, obviously we've got our primary home, and then we also have a commercial property, with the business, which has appreciated in value. And if your listeners are familiar with the concept of house hacking, we're kind of doing the same thing on the business side. So we've got an upstairs, downstairs. We use the upstairs, we rent down the downstairs, and the downstairs kind of pays for the mortgage, essentially. Wow. So that's the approach we took with the commercial property. That's becoming harder and harder just in today's market, interest rates and so forth. When I think about our financial plan, when I think about kind of building our own net worth, I really think about it as a three-legged stool. Okay. I think about it as the business, kind of the equity of the business and what we're building. So as we look at building Your Financial Pharmacist, it has a value. It has a value that we could potentially sell internally or externally. So, and that I will say for us is probably the fastest of the three stools or the three legs of the stool I'm going to talk about. The second one would be real estate. We just kind of talked about that. And then the third one is what I'd call kind of more traditional investments, right? 401ks, IRAs, Roth IRAs, brokerage accounts, custodian accounts. Many of these are tied up until 59 and a half, until retirement. Not all of them, but many of them. And the reason why I like that three-legged stool approach, or at least what's worked for us, is they each have diversity within them, but obviously diversity between them and different risk tolerances and approaches, and they have different purposes and values. And so, obviously how we approach the business, what happens in the real estate market, what happens in the traditional stock market, all can be three very different things. It also taps into a little bit of the creativity side of, like, for me, I'm not saying this isn't a good approach for someone else, but if I had all of our funds in a traditional investments, like, it'd be kind of boring, So like, there's, that side of it as well. But let me be clear to your listeners. It wasn't we finished paying off the debt and now we start investing, because what we know about investing, especially when we look at time value of money, what Albert Einstein was talking about when he said, hey, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. Yeah. Time is the valuable metric, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people like to focus on stock picking or, choosing the right allocation. Mm-hmm. Allocation is important, but how long you are invested is the most important variable. Mm-hmm. And so when I came out of pharmacy school at 24, even while we were starting to pay off the debt, we were investing. Okay. So we were, we did the basics first, get the emergency fund set, make sure you've got no credit card debt, right? Play defense before you play offense. But we weren't only paying off the debt. And the reason that was important is that we then had those 8 years ish from 2018 to 2015, 16, where we were also investing and saving while we were paying off the debt. So now when we get to 2015 and the debt's paid off, we're not starting from zero. Mm-hmm. And that was especially important because if you look at the kind of stock market and what's happened in the markets, right? 2008 hit bottom. Yeah. And outside of some blips over the last here or there with the pandemic and the tariffs here back in April, it's pretty much been an upward trend, right? So, when you start at a low point, you're obviously buying a higher volume, your dollars go further. So really having time in the market was huge, because I don't think we would have gotten there. We started investing at 24, right? 25. Wow. So I am an advocate for finding some balance. Now, how do you balance those two? It depends a little bit. Like, what's the interest rate of the debt? What type of debt is? How do you feel about the debt? What's your time horizon? If someone's more, say, second career and they're behind on retirement, like, they probably don't want to wait. If someone's, young and they're single and they want to get rid of the debt, maybe they could wait a little bit. So there's a lot of variables here that you got to think about. But I want to make sure to be transparent to those listening. Like, we didn't just pay off the debt and then just start investing. Those were happening in parallel.
Gotcha. So between the three assets of traditional stock investing, your commercial real estate property, and your financial planning company, that together is what where like the network of yours really started to build and bring up. Okay, that's really interesting. And so for those, if like you're speaking to a pharmacist or like a high figure earner right now, and nowadays, like, don't get me wrong, 6 figures is a lot, but because of the nature of inflation, like, it may not feel like a lot, especially depending on the city you live in. If you're in New York or California, good luck. Like, it's like, okay, you just feel like another human being, So like, where do we start? Like, if someone wants to become a 7-figure pharmacist, like, how would you plan towards that goal for people in a career like a pharmacist, or something?
I just wrote a blog article on this morning, so it's probably top of mind, but actually it was on LinkedIn. But to me, it really goes back to the mindset. Like, what are the habits and behaviors of those that have done this and are doing it? And if you haven't read before, your listeners haven't read The Millionaire Next Door by Dr. Tom Stanley, that's the whole premise of the book, is he studies those that are millionaires or decamillionaires and really finds out, like, how are they doing it? Where is their money? How did they accumulate their wealth? What are the cars that they're driving? Where do they live? Right. It's a really good research-based approach to the question that you're asking. Yeah. And cost of living is a huge piece of this. A lot of people will be like, Tim, you live in Ohio, it's a huge advantage. I'm like, yeah, it is. Like, yeah. And one of the things we know is that, especially in pharmacy, salaries do not adjust according to cost of living, right? So if you took an ambulatory care pharmacist in Columbus, Ohio, and you dropped them into San Diego, they would make more, but not equivalent more. Yeah, right. So if that's uncontrollable, because you have to live in that area or whatever is the reason, then you got to plan around it. But I would say, if you have flexibility, like, think about it. Think about, are there options that can allow you to do what you want to do from your life goals, from your career goals, while also keeping your cost of living controllable? Because if you look at the biggest pieces where fixed costs are being spent, and therefore we have less dollars available for investing, saving, debt, all the things we're talking about, housing is probably number one on that list, right? That by far is the biggest thing. And especially for something that's going to become a 30-year fixed expense for many people. So how do we control our housing costs? And that's easier said than done based on the market that we're in. But in terms of how do you get started, it's how do we develop the habits and behaviors of those that have done it? And what is the posture of those that have done it? Well, they understand what is an asset and what is a liability. They know the difference. They have an intentional plan month by month of how their dollars get directed, and they typically are paying themselves first. And they automate that process. They never stop learning, so they're just hungry to learn, to grow, to figure out how to be better. They understand this is a continuous learning and never ends. They often have a very philanthropic giving kind of heart and mindset. These are the characteristics, right? We know this information. And so I think it's studying that, understanding that. And then, of course, you got to implement the X's and O's. Yeah. Right. Gotcha. Which, how do we build the emergency fund? How do we pay off the credit card debt? How do we pay off the student loans? But all of that stems from if we don't have the right mindset and approach, we're going to get stuck.
Gotcha. Yeah, here I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this. Because obviously going to pharmacy school and just college in general, most people have some type of debt, whether that's student loan debt, credit card debt, mortgage debt. But then also you want to invest. And I'm curious, where do you tip the line? Do you focus on investing first? Do you focus on paying off the debt? Because it's like how would you go about doing that? And, I know it's nuanced for everybody, but you had to say like a general path, or like perhaps, what would you say would be like the most efficient way of doing this?
It's probably the most common question I'll get is like, should I invest or should I pay down the debt? And as you mentioned, obviously it's very much, it depends. It's very nuanced. Not all debt is created equal, right? Some debt is secured to an asset. Some debt is unsecured. What is the credit position? I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that. So at a high level, the things that I'm thinking about are as follows. First of all, what is the interest rate on the debt that we're talking about? Right? Because we can't look at all debt equally. If you have let's say a 3.5%, 4% undergrad subsidized loan versus an 8.4%, which is what they were last year, unsubsidized graduate loan, we can't treat those the same, right? Because, if you look at the historical rate of return of the stock market, net of inflation since the Great Depression, we're hovering somewhere around 7%. Now, typically somebody's not going to have a 100% equity portfolio, but think about that number, right? So if I have debt at 8% or 9%, 10%, some of the private loans, credit cards, 20%, right? If I have debt that's significantly higher than that, then often that's going to really incentivize us to really want to focus on the debt for a couple of reasons. One, it's just a math equation. But the second, there's certainly an emotional piece and factor there as well. But also what we need to consider is that one is known and one is not known. What do I mean by that? If you have an 8% student loan and you pay it off, we know what we're getting. If you put money and invest it, the market might go up 12%, it might go down 15%, or anywhere in between, or higher, even lower. Right? So you can't just look at that number I gave, historical rate of, the market net of inflation, 7%. You can't just look at that in isolation, because we have to almost factor in like some risk in that as well. So this is not advice, but personally, I kind of look at probably somewhere around like 5% as a line of demarcation. What do I mean by that? If I have debt north of 5%, I'm probably focused on paying off the debt. If I have debt less than 5%, I'm at least looking at, is there any advantage of paying this off early or not? Right? Might I be better off investing or doing other things? And obviously that can also depend on where are you at with other parts of the financial plan. So there's the interest rate, but then there's a piece that a lot of people forget, which is, and there are some situations. Let me give you one example. I had a pharmacist on our podcast a few years ago that paid off $345,000 of student loan debt in 5 years. Okay. Wow. If you run the numbers on that, it's like almost all of their take home pay.
Salary.
Now for her, the reason why, because you look at that and say, that's pretty wild, right?
Yeah.
But for her, like, she had a very, very strong aversion to debt. And so like, yes, the numbers mattered, but she knew herself that there was a very emotional component there. So in my opinion, if somebody is thinking about this, we need to factor both of these. And then of course, look at some other things like, if it's saving for the future, well, how old are we? Are we 50 wanting to retire in 10 years, or are we 25 and we have our whole career in front of us? That matters, right?
Yeah. That's such a powerful point. It reminded me of this book I read called The Psychology of Money.
Yeah.
I don't know if you read it, by Borg and Housel. And that was like one of the first books I read that really emphasized like how you actually feel about whatever debt you have. Because I feel like there's just so many people doing X, Y, and Z, not really acknowledging the fact that everybody feels different. Right. Like for example, that great example you brought, someone paying off nearly $350K in 5 years, being extremely debt averse. Whereas for me, I'm only 30 years old and I purchased 3 real estate. Obviously, I didn't just do it all cash. It was a lot. It was leverage,
right?
And that's a lot of debt. But honestly, it doesn't scare me that much, despite me being that leverage, and I don't think she would be willing to do what I did at such a young age, because that's a lot of debt to her. You know what I'm saying? But for me, I feel confident with the risk as long as I'm paying off the bills and my tenants are paying on time, and I'm okay with that. But I don't think everyone's willing to do that.
Yeah, and I think that understanding yourself and your risk tolerance and mirroring that or matching that with your goals is so important.
Yeah,
right? Because we obviously have to take on a certain level of risk when it comes to things like retirement planning and saving for the future. If we stuff our money in a checking account, we're going to be in trouble, right? Because of inflation. In a high yield savings account, you get a cut it either. Like we got to take some level of risk. So that's just the reality. But how much risk we have to take? What are our goals? This is where I get frustrated with kind of like the general, you should do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
It depends. Like, it really does on like what's going on in the financial plan. How do you feel about this emotionally? Often there's two people involved. So do you have different risk tolerances? How do we reconcile that? And then how do we put a plan together that's both going to work and you are comfortable with?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then to add even more nuance to it, you may be single or you may have a family. That's a huge factor too, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, man. So going into that now, I know, I'm curious because as someone who has a financial planning company, you must come across a lot of people with relatively good jobs that pay well. What do you see the most is keeping people, pharmacists and other high figure earners like financially stuck? Because I know there's a lot of people that even though they're making a pretty good high income, like their bank account wouldn't show it. So what do you think is keeping people financially stuck in your experience?
Yeah, I think what really gets to the core, and I won't dwell on it because we've already talked about it.
Yeah.
I think if you really peel this back, I think for a lot of people, it's the mindset and belief that they can do it, and kind of taking off some of the self-perceived ideas of what is possible. What do I mean by that? When someone's making $120,000, $130,000 coming out of school, that's a big number.
Yeah.
Right. But that kind of becomes a fixed ceiling in our minds.
Yeah.
So what's possible, what they can do with that. If I were to tell Ike coming out of school, and maybe you'd have been the exception, but if I were to tell a new grad coming out of school, like, hey, I think you should be a 7-figure pharmacist by 40, a lot of people look at me like, who's this quack guy, right? Like it ain't possible. So there's a huge mindset piece, but then there's also a big practical piece. You know, when we look at actually that coming to reality, and you're absolutely right. I talk with pharmacists all the time where it's, hey, I make a great income, often dual income in the household, $200,000 to $300,000 plus, 10, 15, 20 years in, not a whole lot to show for it in terms of net worth. So what are those things that are getting in the way? You know, typically the big ones are housing costs, student loan payments, childcare, and car payments. You know, those are the 4 things that are getting there. So yeah.
Got you. Okay, that's good to know. So obviously, definitely, like I think you mentioned in the beginning, saving as much money as possible and using a little expense. Something I feel like doesn't get talked about enough because it's kind of a hard thing, like you mentioned, to grasp because it's a limited belief. Is as pharmacists, like, okay, our income maybe max is 120K, maybe 130K, maybe 150K if you stay at a company for long enough or whatever, get promoted. How outside of that, how do we go about perhaps increasing our income or having other ways of revenue? Because obviously one strategy, and it's definitely a valuable strategy, is to decrease as much expenses as possible. But I would also think increasing your income also helps too, obviously, you know?
Yeah, I think both, right? You know, often people say, you know, it's one or the other. It's both. It's the double whammy, right? Can we increase the income side of the equation and potentially reduce the expense side? And often this isn't forever. Like sometimes when I talk with people, they're like, like I didn't work so hard to be like cutting. I'm not saying like don't get your cup of coffee. That's not what I'm saying. But if we can focus on, you know, being diligent, being intentional, especially as we're trying to knock out some of these goals and look at how we increase our income, boom, right? That's where things take off. And better yet, if we have a system in place that allows us to know what we're going to do with that income when it does happen, either in the form of raises, new jobs, side hustles, other income, so that when that income comes in, I know exactly what I'm going to do with it. That's really where we see the powerful effects, because otherwise raise comes in, lifestyle goes up, bonus comes in, it gets spent, and we don't have an intentional process to spend it. So yeah, I think both are important. Now, if we talk about the income side, let's dig deeper there for a moment. I just wrote an article last week about negotiation. Like pharmacists are inherently terrible at advocating and negotiating for themselves. They're just not comfortable, right? And I get it. It's an uncomfortable situation. So there's opportunities to grow income both within your role, right? That could be through something like a negotiation, because if you've been working for an employer for 5 or 10 years and every year they give you a $1,000, $2,000 raise, hey, if inflation's at 3, 4, 5%, you make 130 and they give you a $2,000 raise, that's not even keeping up with cost of living, right? So let's call it for what it is, which is a cost of living adjustment, maybe. But if we've been providing value, we can document that value, we have leverage, we need to know how to negotiate for our salary and for our position, also not non-salary things. So that would be one, I would say. And then are there growth opportunities internally or externally? And are we positioning ourselves for those growth opportunities? So, you know, a lot of pharmacists have somewhat of a fixed income outside of those small performance or cost of living adjustments, but are there things that we can be doing to advance our skills or otherwise that might give us some opportunities for either jumping organizations or promotions within an organization? And then of course there's the whole, well, what else? You know, call it real estate, call it side hustles, call it additional income. Like what else can we be doing that might take the ceiling off of our income? And this is the concept that we need to be thinking about from a mindset standpoint. I wrote an article a few weeks ago that I said, hey, if I told you about a pharmacist that was making $270,000 a year, like what would be your visceral reaction? And a lot of people, it's like, I either don't believe it or like, it makes me feel uncomfortable, or like, is this real life? Are they selling something that they shouldn't be selling? And the point of the exercise, and I do know pharmacists that are making great incomes and they've done often non-traditional things, but the point of the exercise is to check in with yourself about the upper limit and the ceilings we've kind of put on our mindset of what's possible, right? Because if you think 130 is the ceiling, guess what will be the ceiling? 130. Right?
Yeah, definitely kind of taps into your limiting beliefs. Because I if you told me someone was making 250K as a pharmacist, I would be like, how? What? Like, you know, even I would have a hard time believing that. So one thing you mentioned that was just really interesting to me is negotiation. I do think that every person who gets a new job has the opportunity to negotiate. Now, I don't think the majority of people, including myself, I'll be honest, do not do negotiations. You know, maybe because of out of fear of like, I'm new, I don't want to lose the opportunity. How often do you hear about people negotiating and actually like getting something good with it? And if so, what are some negotiation tactics people can use to put themselves in a better financial position?
This is actually something that, one of the things we talk about at Your Financial Pharmacist is when we say comprehensive financial planning, it's not just investments, it's not just retirement, it's not just student loans or debt repayments, anything that has a dollar sign on it. And this would fall into that category. So our team works with clients to do negotiations and to kind of talk them through and walk them through what it could look like, what's equitable compensation, what leverage do they have, what are some salary, non-salary things they can negotiate. And then once we determine what is fair, which is a key part of the that word fair needs to be in your language during a negotiation. That's a key tactic to use. Once we determine what's fair, then we can implement the techniques to actually make the ask and feel good about making it. And I think for all the reasons you mentioned, a lot of pharmacists don't, and this isn't unique to pharmacists. If you actually look at the data, most employers are giving an offer expecting a negotiation, but a minority of employees actually negotiate. So first and foremost, we need to understand that if we believe in that data, then we should be ready to negotiate because the offer is being made with the expectation that we might negotiate, right? So that's number one. The second thing we have to understand is what leverage do we or do we not have? Okay, you have to be honest, or at least get someone else that will be honest for you. If you're just coming out of school or residency or whatever, and this is your only option, only job, you don't have a lot of leverage, right? If you have multiple options, or maybe you're in a strong financial position, so you could sit out for 3 months. If this isn't the right opportunity, you could find something else and keep looking. You're a highly valued employee. You have a specific skill set. You have leverage, right? So you have to understand what leverage you do or don't have, because if you don't have leverage and you try to implement negotiation tactics, it's going to feel slimy and it's probably not going to work. So that's why I always say that, because it's important to outline that before we actually, establish what are some effective techniques. Then you really get into the techniques and understanding the process. One of the books I recommend here, there's a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss.
Okay.
It's a great read. He's a former FBI international hostage negotiator who took his work as a hostage negotiator and brought it into the everyday business world, right? Things like salary negotiation. It's a great read, very practical. And there's some important things he talks about in there, like making sure we use the word fair, right? Human beings want to feel good about a negotiation. We both sides want to feel like it's fair. Again, it has to be authentic, has to be genuine. He also talks about things like making sure that we're using a range when we give a salary. So, and we want to specifically anchor that range. So we don't want to, come back. If somebody says, hey, Ike, how much do you make in your current job? And you just blurt out like 120,000, like we've just put ourselves into a corner, right? So we need to ask more questions, making sure we're putting them in a position of not yes, no, but getting some more open-ended responses. They talk about in that book using things like calibrated questions. So how or what questions that get more information from the other party. They talk about things like mirroring principles, which is just reflecting back the last 2 or 3 words that somebody says to get them to continue the conversation. To continue the conversation, right? You kind of see where that would go. And then there's a really important technique called an accusation audit. And what you do with an accusation audit is you're trying to essentially disarm the other party from what might be a very common objection. So let me give you an example. Let's say you got an offer for $120,000 for a position. And because of all the research you've done and the work that you have, you really feel like a fair number is 135, right? We're pretty far off, right? So you might say something like, this would be an accusation audit, like, hey, hiring manager, like this might sound like a wild request. This might sound like a crazy ask. But based on my research, based on X, Y, and Z, what really feels like fair is somewhere between 134 and 139. And then you have to be quiet, like stop talking, right? So there's a couple things we did there. We use the word fair. We disarm the other party. You're probably going to think this is right, crazy, an unrealistic request or ask, whatever might be the case. And what we're doing in that is a natural human behavior is if you said that and I was on the other side, I'd say, no, right? Like that's not a crazy ask. And again, if you have leverage, we know when we're trying to push here. And then we use that range and we anchored that range. Okay. And then ultimately towards the end of that, we'd really want to use a question that got some more information from the other party. Like, how should we proceed from here? Where should we go next? Right. And like this takes practice. This takes patience and being comfortable with dead space and all the things. But you can see where just a few tweaks can go a long way.
Oh, yeah. And I really like the way you phrase it. Like you phrase it in a way where it doesn't feel like combative or like awkward. Like it seems like we're working towards a common goal. Right. And I think that's really interesting. But it definitely takes a lot of courage because I'm not gonna lie, I've never done that before. but I do recognize the wisdom and the truth, and I can see. And I think why not? At least I think the worst they can say is no. You still have your offer. You just move forward. It's all right, but I tried. That's actually, I feel like that's an underrated tactic. The art of negotiation, especially after getting a job offer that rarely goes talked about, for whatever the reason is. So when doing these negotiations, definitely using the word fair sounds awesome. And I'm curious, like, what's a realistic, like, ask? Like, do you do like 10% of what was offered, or like, because obviously, I would imagine if you said, oh, like, you get a 125K offer, you can't say, hey, I want 175K. I don't know that. It really depends on where do they come in.
What is the data show? If we have any data, this can be challenging, but there are some national data about average pharmacist salaries through like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Some states will do like state salary data through their state association. Sometimes people know someone who already works there, so they might have an idea. So there are ways that we can get data. So where they come in relative to what we feel like is, what does the data support? How is the position categorized? How many years of experience do I have? Do I have a unique skill set that I bring? All these things are going to determine what's that delta or difference between what they're offering and where am I coming back at, right?
Mm.
So it's so variable, based on those things. So the example you gave, if it's a 120, you come back at 175, that'd be pretty rare unless they like completely lowball the offer, or you're talking about a different positioner. So that's a pretty big gap, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it could happen, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah. So I definitely agree. I'm really glad that we spoke about this, and especially in regards to negotiating, because I think will definitely prepare a lot of pharmacists for the benefit of their financial well-being. So Tim, I want to thank you for the time you had on this podcast and for all the knowledge and information you shared. I'm curious, is there anything that you would like to share or promote with the audience or with pharmacists that you think would be very beneficial towards their growth financially?
Yeah, we've got a ton of resources. Thanks for the opportunity. If people go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com, we've got everything from free resources for those that are looking to learn more about retirement planning, investing, home buying, real estate, you name it, all the way to a team that does one-on-one fee-only certified financial planning. So kind of a choose your own adventure. All that information is on the website, yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and appreciate the opportunity to come on the show.
Awesome. And is that where people can find your blog too? Because I know on this podcast, you mentioned that like a couple of times.
Yeah, some of those I mentioned are on LinkedIn. I do a lot already on LinkedIn that aren't necessarily on the blog. So I would love to connect with your listeners on LinkedIn as well.
Okay, cool. Well, look, Tim, it was great speaking with you. I want to thank you for your time, and thank you for all the knowledge you shared about how to upgrade financially and honestly just be the best version of ourselves. I think a lot of people will find value in this episode. And remember, everyone, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. And if God is for us, who can be against us?
Amen.
All right. Amen. Thank you.